Yeah, this is a question that like always brings back memories for me because it's one of the first questions that I ever got asked. Maybe not word for word, but this theme when I became a Christian. And it was my Aunt Regina, and she talked to me about the suffering in her son's life, my cousin Charles, which was quite severe. He had a lot of disabilities. And as this kind of zealous, kind of eager new Christian, I began to sort of spout some of my new philosophical arguments for why God might allow evil and suffering like my cousin Charles's. And my Aunt Regina, she listened really graciously. And then she turned to me and she said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." I've always remembered those words, and as I reflected on it more, I realized that Jesus understood that a lot better than I did. When his good friend Lazarus died, Jesus had waited a couple of days before he went to see him, and by the time he got there, Lazarus was already dead. And Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, they don't seem too impressed, and they come out one at a time. "If you had been here, our brother would still be alive." In a sense saying, what do you have to say for yourself? What's your response? What's your reasoning? What's your apologetic? And I'm sure Jesus could have told them, well, here's why I waited 2 days. I had good reason, and I can explain it to you. It was justified. And instead, we get the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. So before he tried to respond to this type of question, there was genuine emotion there from Jesus. He never jumped to the philosophical, but he wept first. And so, look, even in this room, there are going to be people who are suffering pretty significantly at the moment, even in a room, this size. And so the first thing I want to say is just that that's not right. That's not the way things are supposed to be. I'm sorry, and I don't want anything that I say theologically or philosophically to undermine the significance of that. And yet I do think that there are maybe some helpful things that we can say in response to this question. My sort of training is in academic philosophy. And interestingly, in that area, there's a lot of talk of natural evil. It's like a phrase that's used to talk about things like earthquakes and tornadoes and pandemics. And I've always thought it's like a funny phrase. Because if it's genuinely natural, like if it's just the universe doing its thing, if it's just a random atheistic universe, it's just time plus matter plus chance, then in what sense is it evil? Like maybe we don't like it, maybe we got unlucky, but it's just the universe doing what the universe does. It doesn't seem like there's any sort of deeper reality that's evil. And then on the other hand, if it is genuinely evil, these things that cause suffering, then is it natural? Or is it actually unnatural? The very fact that we call something evil, does that point to the fact that actually this is not the way it's supposed to be? There's like an intentionality and a purposefulness in the universe, a direction it's supposed to head in, and this is contrary to that. So I really appreciate the way this question was phrased, that in the question it recognizes evil as a category. And not every worldview does, but I think it's significant that the Christian worldview does. Let me add another perspective to this. One of the most significant forms of suffering that Joe and I have experienced as a couple is going through a miscarriage. And we were completely unprepared for how deeply that affected us. And when we first heard from the doctor, you have this baby that's growing inside, and you go to the doctor and you can't wait to hear the heartbeat of your baby, and then there's just this deafening silence. And when we got back to the car after they had told us it was very likely the baby would be miscarried, we decided that we would name the baby Luca. And then we didn't really feel like going home. We certainly didn't feel like going home and cooking, and we just sort of Googled like top pizza place in the vicinity in that town. And we then drove to the pizza place, and we look up. We hadn't looked at the name. We just hit number one, click directions, and then we look up, and it was Luca's Pizza was the name of the pizza place. And it felt like just this kindness of God, just saying that he was present even though we didn't fully understand. Joe got pregnant soon thereafter again, and we now have a son named Jonathan Lucien Vitale, and we named him Lucien as his middle name as a way of remembering and honoring Luca, because we realized at some point that if Luca had not been miscarried, Joe still would have been pregnant with Luca at the time that she conceived Jonathan. We literally could not have Jonathan as our son had this suffering and this death not occurred. It was literally life that came out of death. And it just made us realize that so often we don't realize how things are interconnected. So often we want to just wish a certain piece of suffering out of this world, and we don't think how it's connected to other things that we love and that we value. And in this case, we feel like we have a family that includes Luca and Jonathan and our son Raphael, and that one day we could actually be together as a family of 5 rather than as a family of 4, and that never could have been the case afterwards. Otherwise. And so oftentimes I think we picture this world with all of its suffering in it. Then we picture a very different world with far less suffering or no suffering, and we think to ourselves, surely God should have made me in this very different world, the world with no suffering. And the question that we never think to ask ourselves is, would it still be you and me and all of the people that we love who would exist in that very different world? And that's a really complicated question. You know, if I was mad at my dad at some point, I might get frustrated with my mom that she married my dad and think, Mom, you should have married somebody else. Like, I could have been better looking, more athletic, taller, stronger. Like, maybe they would have been British royalty, like the Queen, right? And I could have lived in a castle. But I don't stop to think that if my mom married someone else, it wouldn't have been me who came to exist. It would have been someone else. And I think oftentimes when we imagine we wish God had made and sustained a different world, we're doing the same thing. We're actually unwittingly wishing ourselves and all the people that we love out of existence. There's actually an interesting analogy here between divine creation and human procreation. Because having a child, I just spoke about it, it's actually a much more sobering choice than we often think about. We want to think about the positive aspects of having a child, right? All the good that's going to happen in that child's life. But as a human parent, if you choose to try to have a child, you're doing something that you know full well will cause serious suffering in the life of the child that you have. Because any life, even the most fortunate of lives in this world, includes serious suffering. And even beyond that, at some point, that child is going to suffer death. And that's a really sobering thought. But it makes me realize that if we think it would be evil to create someone into a world that will include serious suffering in their lives, like if that's our position, and that might at first seem pretty reasonable, but if you agree with that statement, you will not only need to call God evil, you'll also need to call evil anyone who decides to have a child. And it's so interesting how often we don't hold ourselves to a standard that we hold God to. We look up and blame God for our suffering. Same God who, when he suffered at our hands, he looked down and he said, Father, forgive them. A few thoughts on this question. There's so much more to say. Maybe the last thing I'll say is just we shouldn't expect to have all the answers. God's ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Our son Raphael has a bicuspid valve. It's not dangerous to him at the moment, but it's an anomaly in his heart. And so I remember when he was very young, having to take him for those first tests, and they put these sticky things all over his chest, and he having to get needles, and he's just shrieking in horror. I mean, it's like the worst thing possible to him. And actually, it's good for him. Like, this needs to happen. Like, this is how we're diagnosing what he has. This is like actually the process of healing. But that's not how he experienced it. And I couldn't communicate to him why, right? In his being, he was screaming why. And it's not that I wasn't intelligent enough. I knew why. I could talk to Joe about why, but I couldn't communicate that to him because my ways are higher than his ways. How much higher are God's ways than our ways? And I remember in that moment, the only thing I could do was I just drew as close as I could to him. I just went down really close to him, and I just kept saying, I'm here. I'm here. I'm here. And it just makes me think that that's exactly what Jesus has done. We're not always going to understand all of his ways and why we go through what we go through. But the Christian faith is the one worldview where we can say that the one who does know, he came. And he said, I'm here. Jesus is God saying, I'm here. I'm here. He says, here I am. I stand at the door and knock. Anyone who hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in and eat with him and he with me. So I don't think that evil and suffering, I don't think it's how it was intended to be at the beginning, but I do think that God intended you. And if you can begin to get your head around the idea that God wanted you with all of your idiosyncrasies and all of your flaws, then you can begin to get your head around the idea that maybe God would value a world that would allow for you to come to exist, even if that was a world that for a time would include a lot of evil and suffering, but just for a time, because at some point God is going to wipe away all the tears. A beautiful detail in that verse. It doesn't just say the tears are going to be gone. It says that Jesus himself, physically resurrected in his body, is going to wipe away every tear from our eyes.